Hi, and welcome to CryptoBiography. I'm your host, Brandon Starr, and this is episode 211 of CryptoBiography, and it is part 8 of snake magic. And if you hear a few noises in the background, it's because I'm recording this on the evening of July 4th, and even though fireworks are illegal in this particular city, I've already heard several pops and, other noises of fireworks at a distance. So we're just going to have to roll with it, I think. Anyway, here we go. Even as the cook wagon started to creak its way along, she saw Wilfred and Eugene both mounted, wheeling and yelling, making another big show of their preparedness. She heard footsteps rapidly approaching the front of the wagon, and when she looked back to see what was happening, Ogden was reaching down, presumably to help someone climb up to the seat. And he was. It was Garrick, but he didn't sit next to Ogden on the seat. Instead, he clambered over into the cook wagon proper. Neidre pulled her tail out of the way and watched as Garrick marched to the back of the wagon. Leaning right over the shelves that formed the partial back wall of the wagon, he pulled out one of the Canid's orbs. It was lit from within by a soft bluish glow. He began muttering under his breath. The orb's color changed to red, and as he held one hand out, the light started to flow from the orb, through his body and out of his hand behind the wagon. Neidre was looking over his shoulder. There was movement in the trees, and multiple creatures burst out into view. The Arthids, the bear demi-humans. Neidre had never seen one before, as there were none on Master Caedmon's estate, but there were stories of them, and she had seen a bear once cross the back of the estate's sprawling property. They seemed to be all of a kind like Martha, having the upper body and face of their animal, in this case, bears. But they were huge, seeming to be, on average, as tall as the very tallest human men Neidre had ever seen. They carried clubs and other simple weapons and had no armor, but simple garb, which mostly left them bare-chested unless you counted the thick hair. They were also broader in the chest than men. They terrified her. They were coming out of the trees, and it was clear that, though on foot, they were much faster than the creaking wagons. Garrick continued his chanting, and the now bright orange energy spilled out of his hand and reached the ground. Sparks flew up whenever it did, and tufts of grass on the road sizzled from the heat. Soon it was like a lake of fire behind the wagons. This lake also began to spread left and right, even beyond the road. Eugene and Wilfred had moved their horses well in front of the pool. It reached some of the trees, and almost at once flames started licking the trunks. The Arthids stopped, utterly stymied by the pool of magical flames in front of them. They screamed in some language Neidre did not understand. They shook their fists and their weapons, but they could not follow. Garrick continued his chant, though Neidre noticed that he was controlling the width of the pool so that the flames were no longer wider than the road. Soon the Canid's orb went dark, and the spell had no more fuel. The road still glowed hot as they continued to roll away, the heat itself, even from a distance, warming Neidre's face. So that's what you mean by magic for battles, she thought. At least one way of doing it. She kept looking back, expecting that the Arthids would skirt around the sea of flame and chase them again, but she saw no movement. Perhaps they'd been cowed by the display of magic. Garrick, too, was looking behind them. He was breathing heavily, which surprised her. Wasn't the energy from the spell coming from the Canid's orb? Or was this from nerves? She tried not to move or make noise. She didn't know what sort of mood Garrick was in, and if she interrupted his train of thought, she might be punished. She had gotten very good at avoiding trouble with the various humans who had power over the demi-humans on Master Caedmon's estate. Eventually his breathing eased, and he turned and saw that Neidre was looking out the back of the wagons. He made no comment, but moved past her to the front of the wagon. He plopped down next to Ogden on the seat and rested there a while. Neidre kept looking at the back, still wondering if there would be an attack. Finally, Garrick jumped off the wagon and went back to his carriage. Neidre found herself looking behind her cook wagon, regardless of the threats seemingly evaded. There was no safe place for her in the wilderness. If the mission failed, the Arthrids would surely kill her, or some other danger they had not yet even seen. Neidre, after a long time, felt exhaustion steal over her, and she lay back down and went to sleep. There were no more attacks that night. The morning meal saw everyone discussing the evacuation and the Arthids. How many were there? Were they just trying to scare them off, or had they narrowly avoided a serious fight? No one, it seemed, had answers. Neidre's ingredients were now pared down to the minimum. They had reasonable amounts of the basic items, but spices and herbs were now all used up, and only potatoes and onions were still fresh. She had meal to make bread, but there was no more butter. She was instead using oil from a large canister to give it some texture and allow the dough to rise properly. She had kept some of the yeast starter alive this entire time, but its strength was dwindling. The bread was a little flatter and a little harder each day. Eugene started riding right behind the cook wagon all the time. At first, Neidre was inclined to think that they were being careful not to be attacked. Eugene was right behind her, so when she looked back, he was often looking at her. This she could wave away, as there wasn't much for him to look at besides the cook wagon that he was directly following. But eventually, when she realized that he was looking at her every time she looked back, she decided that something was going on. What? She had no idea. And that's the end of the episode for this week. If you have any comments or questions about this episode or previous episodes, CryptoBiography@gmail.com, or hit us up on Facebook or Twitter. And thanks for listening. Words and music copyright 2021 CryptoBiography LLC, all rights reserved. Characters and events are fictional, fictionalized, or satirical.